Hello. For our archival research assignment for HIS 318, Histories of the Wild West, I decided to explore the rise of liquor capitalists in San Francisco during the Gold Rush era, specifically from the 1840s to the 1880s. Essentially, I wanted to track how multiple men from the East were able to build a significant fortune off of liquor bootlegging and distribution in such a short time. Essentially, people were able to capitalize off of the gold rush quickly, not through mining itself all the time, but selling goods to the miners, goods and services to be specific. The lack of governmental regulation and societal norms allowed the mass of new arrivals to create what Michelle Corey called Wicked California in her work. Specifically, the video will look at the profitability of liquor sales in red light districts and how these distribution areas new arrivals could become prominent capitalists in San Francisco. I used two examples in this archival research, one more prominent than the other, but both lives paralleled each other in some ways. The first will be Alexander R. Baldwin, and the second is Anson Parsons Hoteling, also known as A.P. Hoteling. But before we examine their lives in the West as liquor distributors to prominent capitalists, let's step back to where this is all happening. This is a rough map of the trails taken from the east towards California in the mid-1800s. Many people moved through these trails as gold was discovered in California in 1848. Alexander R. Baldwin, for example, may have used these trails to reach California from New York, where he was from. In the next slide, this is a photograph of miners who migrated to San Francisco in the mid-1800s for the gold rush. As we can see from this photograph, they are all men. The question remains, though, what did they do all day? What was their daily life like? Well, according to research from Rohrbough, they worked the majority of the day in mining areas on the outskirts of town, and their home quarters lacked comfort and stability and consisted more of shanties and tents placed on the outsides of proper urban areas, as that is where they could dig for gold. Here is the citation for Rohrbough for reference. And on the next slide, this is a painting from a museum in Sacramento, California. It demonstrates a typical day of what life was like for the gold miners at the time. It is a much more romanticized perception of mining conditions compared to the photograph shown previously. However, this painting shows us clear information. There were many miners in one area working, and there are a few settlements created, as we can see in the painting, but those structures seem much smaller than the amount of men that we see in this image. And this sudden population boom due to the gold rush led to these men filling up available lodging or building makeshift tents to create housing, which meant that any downtime that they had, they tried to spend it elsewhere due to these cramped conditions. And on to the next slide. This is what a typical saloon may have looked like during the mid-1800s in San Francisco. We are looking at J.M. Heinolds Saloon. The photograph was taken in 1885, so it is at the later end of our timeline, but this photograph is still relevant. Due to a lack of regulation around liquor distribution, it was quite a bit easier to work in the industry without needing licensing or a regulatory body. Michelle Corey argues that, quote, being away from family and other forces which impose traditional values, these miners often broke away from accepted behavior. They socialized at saloons, gambling houses, and sporting arenas, end quote. Which is a cultural reason as to why there was such a boom in these industries in the West, which was not as reflected in the East. According to Herbert Asbury's book, The Barbary Coast, quote, wages and profits were so high and there was no comfort at their sleeping quarters. Men spent money freely at different places of riotous excess, and were indeed forced to pass their hours of leisure or recreation at drinking bars, billiard rooms, and gambling saloons, end quote. Saloons were an important tool in building some form of social culture for the new arrivals. California was considered the Wild West partly due to a lack of social and governmental regulations to prohibit people from taking part in what was considered immoral behavior by people in the East, which saw the immense boom of alcohol sales at institutions such as gambling houses, saloons, and brothels, which all sold alcohol, as it was integral to upselling their other services. A lack of pre-existing infrastructure allowed liquor dealers to sell alcohol that was highly unstable and had led to alcohol poisoning numerous times and led to an increased demand of imported liquor from the East. The lack of regulations allowed prominent liquor distributors to sell imported liquor at a premium, especially whiskey. That was the most sought after alcohol at that time. This allowed them to increase their profit margins substantially than if they dealt in the West, which also had higher taxation. And here is the citation for Michelle Corey's work, Wicked California. And on to the next slide, I would like to show you the El Dorado Gambling Hall, which is considered the first gambling hall in San Francisco. The El Dorado Gambling Hall, which was, in a very, very simple sense, a much larger and upscale version of J.M. Heinold's saloon as seen in the previous slide. The gambling hall is often cited in literature focused on San Francisco's Gold Rush period, especially on literature focused on gambling houses and liquor sales. At this point, gambling had evolved from being only done on the outskirts of town among the actual miners, and now it had included the upper class communities of San Francisco. A clear example is the El Dorado Gambling Hall. According to Asbury, all establishments associated with the immoral behaviors of the miners also had always existed amongst the upper class. It was just considered more tasteful. Places like El Dorado made substantial profit, quote, by charging outrageous prices for liquor served during the function. And many upper-class establishments chose a business model where, according to Asbury, quote, their revenue was derived solely from admission and from the sale of liquor, which demonstrates how integral liquor was to these businesses, like El Dorado Gambling Hall, and how integral these businesses were to liquor. On the next slide, I would like to talk about the most well-known red light area of San Francisco, the Barbary Coast, which, side note, has led to the creation of a Hollywood movie called The Barbary Coast in 1935, but we won't talk too much about that. The Barbary Coast was a quintessential example of illicit or immoral activity which was prevalent in parts of the West during the Gold Rush, as we can tell by this sketch from the San Francisco Examiner. The Barbary Coast and the people who had dealings there in various industries such as liquor, gambling, and prostitution are not visible in the archival newspapers found online, because this was the red light district, and there is a lack of direct mention as it was considered the unkempt or shady part of town, and members of the upper class did not want to reference it outright. Therefore, there is not a lot of direct mention of the area. However, there are some cartoon sketches about the Barbary Coast in later years as it started to fall into disrepair. Like, for example, the sketch was created in 1893, and the area was heading towards decline as the state began to curtail open sex work and began to regulate the selling and distribution of alcohol. The Barbary Coast was important to the growth of liquor capitalists because it generated immense revenue due to the influx of sailors, gold miners, and businessmen coming to patron the various establishments in the area. As the most prominent red light district in San Francisco, it had the highest number of patrons consistently in the 1800s. The existence of the coast and the upper class areas were integral to the rise of liquor distributors, like the two examples we will now speak about, Alexander R. Baldwin and A.P. Hotaling. Before that, I did add Asbury's citation here for reference. Now, the next person I want to talk about is Alexander Richards Baldwin. This is the first capitalist we'll be exploring. This is what we think he looked like at the time. There were not available photographs of Mr. Baldwin in the archives. However, this is an etching of his face in the headstone at his burial place in Oakland, Alameda County, California. He was born in 1821 in New York. He moved westward to California due to the gold rush and chose to settle in San Francisco. He began his career in the liquor industry as a bootlegger around in the 1840s. He experienced a quick rise from a single bootlegger to owning multiple distilleries, liquor associations, and even expanded to other industries like mining. He is a prime example of how money was not always made in mining for gold, during the gold rush, but in offering goods and services to the miners. In 1862, he was cited in the Daily Evening Bulletin newspaper as procuring the liquor and importing and jobbing business, which allowed him to secure a foothold over San Francisco's liquor market as a key supplier to distributors, and no longer just an individual salesman. It was a demonstration of his quick rise to economic power and a form of fame within the industry. By 1863, just 1 year later, Baldwin had diversified his business acquisitions from just liquor-related businesses to mining. The June 3, 1863 issue of the Daily Evening Bulletin states that Baldwin became a trustee of a prominent mining company, Governor Gold and Silver Mining Company. His obituary notice in the Daily Alta California listed him just as a local capitalist who was originally from New York. There was no mention that his origins in San Francisco, and what allowed him to purchase shares of so many companies was due to his start as a form of an illicit bootlegger in various smaller establishments across San Francisco, and at one point, most likely, had to have been a part of the red light district's goings-on, either the Barbary Coast or some of the more upscale areas like near the El Dorado gambling hall. Alexander R. Baldwin is not a prominent man today as a liquor capitalist. A more notable man whose initial path into the liquor business in San Francisco during a similar time was A.P. Hoteling. But before that, I added these citations that are primary sources which I collected to build a very rough timeline of Alexander Baldwin's life in San Francisco in relation to his work. And now I'd like to move on to the next slide. This is a sketch of A.P. Hoteling with his obituary notice. He was born in New York, same as Baldwin, and chose to migrate to San Francisco as he saw economic opportunity in the gold rush. However, his timing in the mines did not bear the type of profit that he initially believed it would. Instead, he decided to do what many people like him did: sell goods to the miners. He also began working in the liquor distribution business, and over the years began to acquire numerous distilleries and liquor associations in San Francisco, and had becoming a reputed spirit dealer. His name was so well known in liquor-related history in San Francisco that he now has a distillery unrelated to him, now named after him, called A.P. Hoteling & Co. And here I have another citation, apologies for the format, from the New York Times, which talked about his obituary notice and his life and career as a capitalist, but they do mention more about his growth as a liquor capitalist in San Francisco, as he was very famous for his work. And which leads us to our next slide. This is a newspaper clipping from an advertisement section in 1875, and this clipping is significant because it is evidence of Hoteling's quick growth in becoming a liquor capitalist. The clipping says, quote, "There are no other genuine J.H. Cutter whiskeys in this market except those by A.P. Hoteling & Co. They having sole control for the last 10 years of this justly celebrated whiskey." End quote. This clipping demonstrates how A.P. Hoteling's growth in San Francisco liquor industry in a very short time period allows us to position him as a liquor capitalist whose wealth was built through a business that, during San Francisco's gold rush era, was often cited as illicit yet highly profitable. And I would like to bring attention to the phrase, "having had sole control over the last 10 years of this justly celebrated whiskey." As we mentioned earlier, whiskey was one of the most profitable liquors being sold in California due to the increased demand for it by the miners and the businessmen, which is why Hoteling having control over one of the most popular whiskeys was incredibly important to his business, as it meant that he not only had a strong position as a distributor like Baldwin, he had a monopoly over one of the most important products at that time. But anyway, I would like to call back to my previous point that he had made his money in an industry that was viewed as illicit, but was probably one of the most profitable areas to be in. Therefore, this rapid expansion of the control of distribution centers and distilleries was made possible by saloons and other alcohol-related institutions, which created a steady demand of liquor that surpassed demand in other areas of the country, which facilitated men like Hoteling and Baldwin to build substantial economic power within San Francisco's gold rush urban environment. Thank you for listening to me. That was my archival video essay. I would like to also bring notice to my bibliography. Here are the primary sources, which I had linked earlier in the presentation, but are also here for perusal as well, alongside the secondary sources, which I also used. And then to the next slide is the photograph citations, which were also listed, but also here for your perusal. Thank you very much.